Hi, I'm Suzanne Turner, and welcome to a podcast delving into the personal narratives within the clinical research industry. Through candid interviews, we'll learn about the personal journeys and motivations of individuals who have chosen this profession, what I like to call their why. This podcast is not just for industry insiders. It's for everyone curious about the human side of healthcare. Beyond the industry's negative reputation, we'll shed light on the dedicated professionals behind clinical trials. Join us as we uncover the heart and passion of those working tirelessly behind the scenes in clinical research. Welcome to Heart of the Trial. Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome to Heart of the Trial, where we dive into the human side of healthcare, highlighting the voices often left out of the spotlight. I'm your host, Suzanne Turner, and in this episode, I'm joined by fellow Suzanne Vyvoda, whose clinical research journey spans over 20 years in multiple perspectives, from site coordinator to fractional executive. We talk about what it's like to pivot across the industry, how silos between sites, CROs, and sponsors can be broken down, and why she's passionate about mentorship and system-wide improvement. Suzanne shares how she bet on herself more than once, built a thriving consulting career, and why she believes clinical research is a space where anyone can succeed. I hope you enjoy, and until next time, stay curious and stay compassionate. Welcome to Heart of the Trial, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It's a pleasure to be here. Love the name of your podcast, and obviously it's wonderful to meet a fellow Suzanne.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was going to say, I don't know about you, but I don't meet a lot of other Suzannes.
You're right. There are not a ton of Suzannes. I can definitely echo that. My mother-in-law's name is Susan, which it doesn't make things confusing at all. But yeah, Suzanne is a little bit unique. And I'm sure you're used to being called Susan all the time as well.
Every day when people do it and they're like, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, happens literally every day. And you actually have to contend with there being another Susan with the same last name.
Yeah, I do. Indeed. That's a little unique. So that makes things a little extra complicated.
Yeah. Do you guys get looks when you go places together and you introduce yourselves?
You know that she lives in England. We don't see her that frequently. So there aren't a lot of occasions for that, unfortunately. I mean, I'll go to England anytime. Just try and stop me. But yeah, unfortunately, she's quite far away.
Oh, well, that's just so crazy, though. Okay, well, why don't we start by having you tell our listeners what it is, like introduce yourself and what it is you do.
Okay. Well, my name is Suzanne Vyvoda. I've been in the clinical trial space going on just over 20 years now. I have worked at the site at a CRO and both big and small sponsor companies. Right now, I'm a fractional executive for a number of small biotech companies. I consult strategically for either biotech companies or biotech adjacent companies. Think CROs, vendors, folks that are interacting in the biotech space. And I'm also very passionate about mentoring people in the space to up and coming leaders, particularly women who are either, trying to advance within the space, making a pivot, et cetera. So my work is pretty broad based right now. And there's lots of exciting things going on.
That's wonderful. So how is it that you started doing what you're doing? Because it sounds like, did you start at a site then?
My first job was as a clinical research coordinator. So, that is something that I know very well. And, I'll tell you, and I'm sure you know this too, clinical research coordinators are the unsung heroes of clinical research. It is such a hard job. And that's where I got my sea legs. That's where I learned this business. I got a lot of really interesting experiences, back in that time frame where there was really no way to learn that job other than just to do that job. And so I have a lot of interesting stories about learning how to draw blood and spin it down and ship it and take ECGs and just all those things that coordinators get thrown their way. And it can be a really tricky role to navigate. So I just respect the folks that are doing that work so much. And as a coordinator, you get these protocols sent over from CROs, from sponsors, et cetera. And, it was really clear to me during that time period that whoever had written that document didn't know what my role as a CRC was. You're looking at schedules of assessments or, patient enrollment criteria. How many things are there in a protocol? I'm like, this doesn't work this way. And so I think that was what piqued my curiosity about the broader industry and got me really curious, how do I get to sit at the table with the people who are writing this protocol? Because I sure would love to provide some operational feedback on what this looks like at my site. And that sort of ignited this path that I've been on, to figure out really how to get a seat at that table. But yes, I really stumbled upon the career out of college. Went to college. I had no idea really what I wanted to do. And my goodness, my interests were pulled all over the place, from medicine and science to law to business. And, I got a job, and there was a big Intermountain Health Center in the city I was living. And let's just face it, those kinds of places are doing a lot of clinical trials. And my mom was a nurse there. My stepdad was a nurse practitioner, and they said, you know what, just get a job. There's plenty of people who work at hospitals who aren't doctors and nurses. Yeah. And it turned out the physician that I ended up working for was very involved in clinical research and lab research as well. And so it was trial by fire. He came in and handed me a bunch of protocols, and it was off to the races.
Oh my gosh. So this actually kind of leads to what I was going to ask you is like, how many trials were you part of? Or was it that there were a lot over a large time, but like at one time you'd only be on like one or two?
Great question. So I used to keep a list of every trial that I had, contributed to. Yeah. And I stopped that a long time ago because the list got so long. Yeah. So back then, and again, this is many, many years ago, but back then you could be responsible for a couple of trials, but I thought there were moments that I had over 10 trials that were mine as a lead coordinator. And this is oncology. So these are very intense protocols. And I know that everyone here that's touched oncology protocols will appreciate the complexity of those protocols, the complexity of those patients, just their medical histories, the concomitant medications they're on, the data reporting that's required. Probably, some of our most complicated trials that we see in the industry. So back then it was a lot. And but it was also an exciting time. The clinical trials office at the hospital grew significantly in terms of headcount, in terms of infrastructure. There was a lot happening at that point in the industry. There was more, more structure being put around roles like that. But, in the beginning, it really was, it was tricky, and it was, leaning on your fellow coordinators. Have you seen this? Have you had to do this? And working within a large hospital where you'd show up in a room to collect a sample and no one really knew why you were there, because these patients, of course, are interacting with multiple physicians, multiple providers, nurses, and the person that enrolled them in that trial is one point of contact in their care. And so ideally, of course, everyone is aligned in terms of the care that patient's receiving. But let's face it, there are so many points of contact that person is going to get across a cancer journey, that it was a lot of, I'm this person, I'm here to do this. But it was a really great crash course in clinical research. And it was one I think folks either pass and fall in love with or fail and move on from. This industry really does attract, I think, a certain kind of personality, people who thrive in chaos, people who like to solve problems, solve puzzles, people who are very detail oriented, people who describe themselves as type A. We all find ourselves, stumbling upon this career from a whole bunch of different backgrounds and perspectives. And as a result, you get this really neat mix of people who have different backgrounds, different degrees, different entry points into the industry, folks that have been at sites or CROs or a mix of both. People have just been at the sponsor, people at smaller companies, larger companies. It's such an interesting mix of people.
So, okay, so you had this experience at the site, and then you said, I want a seat at the table. So you go from working at a site, working a lot of trials, and your comment about the end user, I think that's very interesting, because I think that happens a lot in this industry, where the person's writing a protocol or a process and not taking the actual end user into account or getting their feedback when they do.
Yes, and that's a certainly a conversation we can get into. But I was also living. I live in San Francisco now, and I live in an area that's thriving with biotech companies, sponsors, big, small. But I didn't live here back then, and I didn't know exactly what that career path looked like. And back then, the feedback that you would get was CRCs don't go to work for CROs. And people at CROs don't go to work for sponsors. Those aren't walls that you can necessarily cross. And I thought, that sounds like a good challenge. Okay. And what I mean by that, it was a lot less common to go from a coordinator role into a CRA role. There's great transferable skills, and we do see it a lot more frequently now. We have a lot of these bridging programs, for example, at the large CROs that are offered. And occasionally you'd see someone make a move like that. But back then, CRAs were CRAs and CRCs were CRCs. And I heard that feedback from a lot of people. And again, this is a long time ago, but I took that as an opportunity, as a challenge. Okay, say I can't do that. I'm going to show you how I can do that.
Well, I find that, to me, it actually seems so obvious. Here you've got the person who does the job and the person who, doesn't oversee them, but they provide oversight from the CRO and sponsor perspective, which means you both have to completely understand.
But that's actually not how it works.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
And I think, one thing I'll comment on is I think how many silos still exist in the industry. I think that sites are very siloed from what CROs and sponsors do and need and want. I think sponsors and CROs are siloed from each other in a lot of ways. They have to partner, but they have very different business objectives and they don't always align. It's hard to understand the perspectives of all of those different parties when you're bringing together a group of vendors, a group of sites, and we all have the patient in mind, but we don't operate as an ecosystem. We operate as very different parts. And so while it seems intuitive, those roles are really, really different roles with a very different hat on. And so while there are a ton of transferable skills that you get out of any of these roles, 100%, it's up to you to be able to take those skills and narrate them in a way that a hiring manager will understand and appreciate. Here's how I'm going to take what I learned and apply it to something I've not done before. And clinical research can kind of feel sometimes like, how do I get in? Because all the jobs require experience. I don't have experience. And it's kind of trying to crack that tough nut, and it can be tough to do. And, these days we're all moving so fast, and hiring managers want someone who can, the phrase is hit the ground running, right? And I get that as a hiring manager for sure. And a lot of this depends on external factors, what the market is doing, what else is going on in the industry. And right now, for example, we're in a really tough market where we've seen a lot of programs fail, cancel. We've seen a lot of layoffs in biotech. We've seen layoffs in big pharma, in big CROs. And so right now, these folks that are wanting to make those kinds of transitions, they are up against hundreds and hundreds of candidates who already have the skill set. So that's a different topic. It's a pivot, but there are a lot of factors that go into whether or not that change is an easy one or a hard one.
Yeah. That makes sense. So how did you do it? How did you take those CRC skills and go to work for a CRO as a CRA, which, the listeners, to make sure they're keeping up with us because of all these lovely acronyms. But the CRA is the clinical research associate that goes to the sites and performs that oversight and gives that feedback to the CRO and sponsor. And then, of course, the CRO is the contract research organization, clinical research organization, whatever you like to call them, that the sponsors hire to run trials for them or large portions of the trial.
Yeah, I want to be careful about that because we actually don't want the CRO to run the trial. We want them to be... We want them to be a vendor. We want them to be a partner. But, one thing that's always important to note is that the sponsor is ultimately responsible for the conduct of the trial.
Thank you. And, thank you from the team of person. Sure. Thank you.
No problem. And we have to demonstrate that in documentation. And that might be another conversation. But it's so important that we make that distinction. Yes. But I did a couple of things. Number one, I knocked down a lot of doors and I didn't take no for an answer. But number two, I was a CRC. We had CRAs coming into our site all the time. Yeah. I paid a lot of attention to what they were doing, what questions they were asking, what their workflow looked like. And so when I went to these interviews, I was prepared to have, I had a really good idea of what that looked like. I talked to them and back then it was much more common for CRAs to sit and chat with CRCs over lunch, get coffee. I picked their brains for absolutely everything that I could possibly get. And I turned that into a really convincing transferable skills story. I was also able to take advantage of a market that was much more receptive to folks that were trying to make transitions like that. And to be honest with you, I didn't stop until I had a yes.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Good for you. I love that. I hope that just what you said inspires so many people because that is amazing. You took it upon yourself. You asked questions, you paid attention and look where it got you, right? So, okay. So once you start working for the CRO as a CRA, is that the only thing you did or did you take other positions from there?
I did. I saw the CRO piece as a stepping stone. I was working for a very small CRO. I was still living in what I would call the wrong place to pursue a biotech career. But I saw it again as a stepping stone to finding a role at a sponsor. And so, yes, I did move up within the CRO and take on more of a project manager sort of role, which was really interesting to kind of see how those folks are really interacting with sponsors, managing projects, managing teams, trying to, prioritize between a lot of different deliverables and just to sort of feel that, animosity that often happens between the sponsor and the CRO, lack of alignment on things like timelines, deliverables, et cetera, how they should be done, when they should be done. Dealing with, however many layers of approval things took. And it was a really helpful experience for me. And, when I went then to the sponsor, and again, same thing, I knocked down those doors until I got a role, because it wasn't an obvious move either. Whether or not you can see the transferable skills, it still was a tough transition. And it was a teeny tiny company that took a chance on me, which was a really interesting experience, not only to see how it works at a sponsor, but at a startup, a startup that really wasn't ready to run a clinical trial quite yet. So I got exposure to a lot of activities going on in the preclinical world, the CMC world, and by CMC, we mean chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. That's how that product is made and ready to put into a clinical trial. But I got to see a lot of the industry. I got to interact directly with the founder, with the bench scientists, with everyone. And so it was a really great experience. But it was the same thing. No one was going to open that door for me. It was talking to people and just not taking no for an answer. And really, demonstrating that I understood how what I had done applied to what they were doing. And, it took off from there. I took my first role in the Washington, D.C. area. I pretty quickly discovered that there was some stuff there, But if I really wanted to pursue this, and again, this is long before COVID, there's no remote roles. I was going to have to come to more of a hub. So I got a role at a company in the Bay Area, and I moved out here to San Francisco in my mid 30s without knowing anyone at all. and that was a big leap to take, but it was a leap. It was a bet on myself. It was a bet on the fact that being in the environment where all of this work was really taking place was going to be a catalyst for my career. And it turns out that was a great bet to take. I've now been here for more than 10 years. I've met a ton of people out here. I met my husband out here. I have had numerous roles in biotech, big companies, small companies. I've made a ton of connections, really grown my network, which is such an important component really in this industry. People say that it feels like a small world, and you look at how many people work in sites and CROs and sponsors, and think that can't be, but it really is true. So the quality of those relationships is really important. And I encourage everyone that's listening to really lean into that network. You never know where those next jobs are going to come from, especially in a market where it's really tricky to find that role. Really leaning into your network is important. But yeah, so, I moved out here, and one job led to another. And I admit within that, there were a lot of ups and downs. There were canceled programs. There were IPOs. There were layoffs. There were acquisitions. There was, every different flavor of experience. But I loved that work, and I loved that I could bring, those different angles, that CRC angle, that CRO angle to that role, and really try my best to optimize the clinical operations space or how trials are conducted with those different stakeholders in mind.
Yes, you have so much there. I wrote notes down on that I want to touch on. But so the first one is, I love your comment about being a small world. Like, we say that all the time because you just run into the same people within the industry. You'll be in completely different companies and be like, oh yeah, we worked together 3 years ago. And or like that cracks me up. And I love what you said. Absolutely love what you said about like that bet that you took on yourself, because I hope the listeners really can pull from that and find inspiration, because that's been my experiences too. Those I call them the big scary decisions. Every time I've made those, every time I've made one of those big I'm getting goosebumps even talking about like those big scary decisions and all, but it's paid off, and it is what helped me advance. And I mean, look where it's gotten you. Every time that you bet on yourself and you're like, this is the decision I'm making and I'm following through, like, you're so inspiring.
Well, that's very kind of you. I mean, I've had help along the way, and I have developed a really amazing network of mentors and peers and folks that I've worked with. And it's become something that I'm really passionate about. At this point, I can now look behind me and see how many opportunities this industry really has. Yeah. And, there are so many hurdles we experience. Trials are expensive. Yes. Trials take forever, but we're at an interesting inflection point with some of the new technologies that are coming out, and it'll be really interesting to see how we adapt as an industry. But I always look for opportunities to break down silos and break down barriers between the stakeholders that are really running the show here. So between sponsors, between CROs, sites, patient advocacy networks. Really, ultimately, this whole machine is designed to better treatment outcomes for patients. And I think we all know that. We all have that somewhere as our North Star. But a lot of the ways that we operate are not necessarily geared in that direction. So I think that when we pause and slow down and think about what does the patient really need, I think that is a really good way to ground ourselves as we continue to move forward as an industry.
Very excellent point. And that's what you do now, right? You've taken all this experience that you've gained through the years and you work on those areas like those connection points.
Yes, to some extent. One thing that I have taken to particularly this year, or I'll back up a notch, at the end of 2023, the company that I was working for was acquired. And that was great. It was a really exciting moment. a product that was a really exciting new treatment, new method of action, and a new mechanism of action. And there was a lot of excitement around that. But anyone that's paying attention right now knows that it has been so hard these past couple of years to find work in biotech. Well, I could have sat there and hoped to find a job. Instead, I kind of went out and created a new path forward. Yeah. And you're probably hearing the word fractional a lot lately. Yeah. And I'll pause there and explain a little bit about what that means. And in 2024, I took on some fractional roles. And those were for leaders that were trying to start companies or were trying to expand companies, trying to raise money and needed some operational support. And that kind of means that you work for them for a period of time on a project, or more commonly, you're embedded within their company for a certain percentage of your time. So, maybe the company needs someone who's an expert at clinical operations, or a CFO, or really anyone, but they have a very limited budget. And remember, for biotech companies, or for any company that does not have a commercial product, there's no revenue. So their balance sheet is going to look very different than that of large pharma, where they have commercialized products and they're bringing in revenue. So a lot of these companies, they're dependent on raising money. If they're not public, if they're public, they're dependent on the market and what the market is going to do and say about what they're doing. And so fractional leadership is really helpful when you need that senior level expertise, but you can't necessarily bring that person on as an FTE. So there are advantages for the company, and that they can tap into people with really deep expertise in their field. But you don't have to bring them on with a full-time salary, with full-time benefits. And as the employee, you can spread that knowledge much more broadly. You can support multiple different companies. You can learn, a whole bunch of different things. You can broaden your network. And I think it's a really mutually beneficial opportunity in this market where it's just been tough lately. So that's part of what I'm up to. I also, I noticed that there were a lot of particularly new companies, tech companies, CROs, SMOs, and I talked to these companies, and a lot of them are great, well-established companies, but these newer companies, again, we work in a siloed industry, and these companies don't necessarily know, gosh, who do I talk to? Who's the decision maker? Like, how do I get traction? Is my product even viable or valuable in this market? And so, I found earlier this year, when I really leaned into thought leadership on LinkedIn, and we can talk about that too, that I got a lot of reach out from these companies. I've built this. I don't know if it's viable. I don't know how to pitch it. I don't know how to sell it. Could you help me? And, some of those have been really interesting experiences as well. Again, it speaks to how disjointed the industry can feel. And there's not an obvious point of entry. If I make a tech product, do I sell it to a CRO? Is it a sponsor? Would it go to a site? And if these folks don't know how trials are run, or don't know how those pieces fit together, it can be kind of a rough puzzle to decode. They also may not have the depth and breadth of industry expertise to even know what kind of a product is going to be meaningful, useful, move the needle. So that's part of it. But I think, some of it has just been, earlier this year, I decided to start, a thought leadership piece and really lean into LinkedIn. And at first, I didn't think I'd have a lot to say, but I think that there's a lot to talk about in biotech and clinical operations and drug development. And I just thought I would start putting myself out there that way in order to build my network, and grow, more organically, if I was going to continue consulting further. And it's actually turned into really quite the passion project. I found that when I started writing, I actually couldn't stop. There was so much to talk about. And one of the things that I do talk a lot about is the disjointedness between different partners in the industry, opportunities to streamline activities and find efficiencies. I try to decode some of the things that are done at sponsors or sites or CROs and why they're done that way, and what's good about it and maybe what's
Right.
not so great about it. Because I'm trying really to educate everyone that's involved in clinical trial operations, how all of these pieces work, how they fit together, and how we can fix it, how we can make it better.
Yes, I'm a big, big believer in understanding the why of things. I truly believe that when individuals understand why they're doing something, they're going to be more successful. They're going to be more willing because they see that bigger picture. That's the approach I take with TMF all the time.
Sure,
I'm telling
sure.
you to do this. Why? Well, now when you understand why, and it sounds like that's your goal. And I've actually seen a lot of your posts on LinkedIn and all. That's how we connected. And
Yeah.
I've loved reading the stuff that you're doing. Like, it's so insightful, and I hope it's bringing a lot of engagement. Do you get a lot of responses and conversations going?
I do. And I'll take it a step further. It's not so much about explaining why, it's also about providing some history and providing some opportunity for improvement, and providing, kind of a look behind the curtain,
Yeah.
you know, at some of the things that actually don't make sense,
Yeah.
and some of the ways that we can actually think about improving those things. So yes, it helps to understand the why. And I love your example of TMF, because
Yeah.
if you're not working in clinical operations, this is a very sort of vague topic. Yes, we file the documents. What does that mean?
Yes.
Why is that important? So there's so
Yes.
much why behind TMF, but
Yes.
there's why behind everything. But
Yes.
sometimes it's not so much why, it's almost why not? Why don't we do it
Oh.
this way? Gosh, why do we write protocols in a silo the way that we do? Why aren't
Yeah.
we seeking broader feedback from folks at the CRO, folks at
Mm-hmm.
sites, from patients themselves even? There's a lot of things that we can do to improve. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, I'm saying this is the why,
Yeah.
but I'm also trying to take it a step further and say, what are the opportunities here we
Yeah.
have to make the why better, more cost effective, more efficient for everyone involved?
Yeah. I love that. That's amazing. And do you find that you get a lot of positivity back from that? People going, "Oh, that's great. That's great thoughts. I hadn't thought about this." Or
Yeah, I've gotten a good amount of engagement. My audience has definitely grown. I think it's sparked some interesting conversations. I definitely get a lot more direct messages from folks who either are trying to start a company of some sort, or are making a career pivot, or looking for a job. It's been it's been an interesting angle, and it's actually something that I've loved learning and doing, and trying to get better at. But really, the ultimate goal is to better the field, and better the thought leadership in the field. And I'm certainly not the end all be all of that. There are so many powerful voices in this space. And the more I've showed up to the space, the more I've gotten to know other thought leaders in the space that are really putting out some interesting ideas about what the opportunities are for improvement. And I think that's really where the conversation is not so much why, because why helps. We want to know why, but I think we do need to take it a step further and say,
Mhm.
okay, but why not something else? Why not something better? Why not something more thoughtful, more patient centric, more efficient? Because there are a lot of opportunities that we have, I think, to evolve as an industry.
Yeah, just because it's always been done this way, does that mean it needs to be the way we continue to do it? Is there a better
Yeah.
way, etc.? That's wonderful. So, okay, so you've had a very wide career starting from CRC going up, and so I get my big question that I like to ask, is like, why do you keep doing it? There has to be something driving all this passion.
Yeah, this passion comes from the fact that, in my view, this field is never going to stop. It's never going to slow down. There is always something new to learn, whether that be a regulation, a new type of therapy. Um, this field is constantly evolving, and so for someone like me, I love the constant challenge, the constant evolution of it. Treatments that I was working on as part of clinical trials back in that CRC role, that first role, some of those are now marketed products that are standard of care for patients. To see things move in that way is exciting, but to see things move as an industry is also exciting. The FDA has evolved. I've learned about many of the nuances between the FDA and other international regulatory bodies as I've run global trials. We often tend to be very United States centric in a lot of the conversations we have, because so much of the research that we do is done by companies in the US. But the reality is, so much of the research we do, many of the trials or portions of the trials aren't done here. They're done ex-US, they're done in other countries. So really thinking more globally about how we think about trials and treatments. And then, the diversity component has become really front and center lately. That is certainly a component here in the US, regardless of where we may or may not feel about the administration. And I will not go into that. But, I think diversity really remains on people's minds in terms of how best to gather data. There was a time when clinical trials were only run on men. I can tell you how that has impacted women's health over time. So when we think about diversity, there are so many opportunities to make sure that we're being thoughtful about how we enroll trials and how we make sure that treatments are really applicable to broad bases of the population.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that you're seeing it from all those different areas, and that's what's helped you grow. And to actually have that experience, I think that's like everyone's dream in clinical research. You've worked on a study and now it's out there on the market. And like you said, like a standard of care, like that's kind of mind blowing. That's like your true success there, right? You feel like all that time and stress and maybe those crying in the shower, was all worth it.
And that's what time will do. And I'll admit there have been many more failures than there have been successes. And we know that in drug development. We know that most of the products are not going to make it to market. And, when I think more broadly outside of my realm, outside of clinical trial operations, and my sweet spot is really that anything from, IND through commercialization, phase 1 through phase 4, any clinical trial, I think a good operator can effectively run any trial and run it effectively. But there are a lot of other ways we can optimize how we develop drugs. And we can do that preclinically. We can do that in manufacturing. We can do that in commercialization. Those are not areas that my expertise necessarily sits in, but I've been lucky to sit in rooms with experts from across the entire drug development spectrum and really hear some of their ideas about how things may continue to develop. And that's one advantage of working, frankly, in smaller companies is you get to hear from those other departments and take part in those conversations about really how to impact the entire cycle.
Yeah, I love when I get to, that's one of the things being in TMF, there's a lot of stuff always going on and meetings, et cetera, that don't necessarily impact me, but getting to hear that is so cool. And that's amazing. So earlier we were talking, you were mentioning how, some of that, I guess you could say, contention between sponsors and CROs and all. Do you feel that this has changed? Do you feel like you've seen growth there throughout your career and in current times? Or
Gosh, Suzanne, that's a tough one. And the short answer is no. The long answer is it depends. And it depends on how those relationships are formed. I think it depends on setting expectations up front. I think it depends on sponsors treating CROs like partners. And I think it depends on CROs really rising to that occasion. So I don't believe in only small CROs or only big CROs. I don't think there's a right CRO or a perfect CRO. There's no perfect sponsor, frankly, either. But it's up to us in the beginning of a trial to really set expectations and align those expectations across everyone that's involved in the trial. That happens as early as an RFI, or request for information, that a sponsor might send to a CRO. Can you do this trial? How would you do it? And really being involved and engaged in selecting a CRO that's the right fit for your project. Mm-hmm. And not just the CRO, the team that's actually going to work on your trial. Are they a fit for your team at the sponsor? Selecting your sites, who's really engaged in working on this product, and who just wants another trial. Really understanding what your sites need, what they're capable of, where you can help them, because at the end of the day, they're your end users, and they are the ones who will enroll or not enroll patients to your trial. So understanding how they operate, what they need, how to make them successful is a really key consideration. But my ethos is that the CRO really needs to be an extension of the sponsor. And that has to be done via relationship building and trust building. And that doesn't mean that there aren't contentious moments, when timelines slip, or things go off the rails, and they do. The reality is, no matter how well we set ourselves up for success, there will be moments when things don't go the way that we plan. But then we're able to really rise as a team to meet the moment in those occasions and work through it. So the most successful trials I've seen are ones where the CRO and the sponsor really can work as a team in concert with each other. And that CRA, who is the person who's representing the trial, they really understand the trial, they understand the sponsor, and they feel like they're set up for success to walk in that room and support the site.
Oh, that's I love the thought of all of that. So I've been
Good
lucky.
Thoughts.
I've been lucky where lately I've been working with some sponsors where they are smaller, and I do feel like they really do try to embrace that more open communication, and like you said, treating them like a partner. And it does give you that, when you hear on the other side, yeah, I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to do this. Yes. Thank you for your input on this. When you hear that in meetings, it really does make a big difference. I think it makes them feel like what they're doing is important too, and you're not just pointing out the negatives or such.
Yeah. And if you think about it, if all you're doing on these calls is telling the CRO what they're doing wrong, the CRO is then going to leave that call with, not the CRO, every individual person. Yes. Let's break it down. Yes. There's a lot of people on those calls. We have ClinOps, we have data management, we have biostats, we have regulatory, we have all of those different people's site contracts and budgets. And so many people are on that call, and they're going to leave with a pretty poor taste in their mouth if it's just this contentious back and forth. This is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong. Now, that may be true. And I'm not saying there aren't tough conversations that you have to have. And trust me, I've had those tough conversations. I've rung the bell all the way up through senior leadership at CROs. I'm not hesitant to do that. But if you can imagine that team getting off that call and they've just been yelled at for an hour.
Yeah.
Are they really going to go and answer that site call with enthusiasm and excitement about that question that site has? I mean, there's a trickle down effect from that. And that doesn't mean you don't have the hard conversations, but I think it's really approaching it from a partnership perspective versus we're the sponsor, you're the CRO, you're the site. The more we reinforce those silos, the less we understand each other. And the less we understand each other, the less we're in a position to really partner and succeed that way.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, always remember to come back to the reason you're doing it, for the patient, patient. So
absolutely.
Oh, well, this has been an amazing conversation. You really are an inspiration, Suzanne. I hope that anyone who's listening, like I hope they come away from this like so pumped and energized, like she did it, like I can do it. I'm going to go for it. Because that's 100% the takeaway I got, and that your energy and all that, you have a lot of faith in yourself. And I think that's what makes wonderful people in this industry, because no one's going to be a bigger advocate for you than you. Right. And
that's right.
And then you have the power to to make such positive impact in your everyday work. So,
well, I really appreciate that, but I'll flip that back on you. You know, something that really stood out to me was the name of your podcast, The Heart of the Trial. Yeah. And I'll give that, you know, to me, that has two definitions. Always the patient. The patient is the heart of the trial. Yes. And we always need to keep that in mind. But I also think of all the people that come together in different expertise, different disciplines, different companies in order to execute these trials. Yes. The heart of the trial is also all of those people who make it happen. And I do encourage, you know, anyone that is listening to this, whatever path that looks like for you, go out there and make it happen, because I have seen some incredible career trajectories unfold within this industry. And it really is a world where anything is possible. Now, there are some very specialized, you know, pieces here. There are the MDs, the PhDs, the folks that are going to really drive the science. But from an operational perspective, I really think it's a world where anyone can be successful.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And that's a perfect place to end it. So before I let you go, how can our audience get in touch with you if they would like to or follow you?
Absolutely. So we'll make sure to tag my LinkedIn here. You can reach out to me via DM. I'm always open for conversations with folks. My email address is Suzanne@VyvodaConsulting.com, and you won't know how to spell that, but we'll link that too when we broadcast it.
Oh, I love that. Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for your time today, Suzanne. I hope you have a good one.
You too. It was a pleasure, Suzanne. Thank you so much.
This brings us to the end of today's episode. I want to extend my sincere thanks to our guest for sharing their inspiring journey. If you'd like to connect with them, you can find their contact information in the show notes. I also want to express my gratitude to you for joining us on this exploration of the clinical research industry. I hope you found today's episode insightful. If so, please consider leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. It truly helps us reach more listeners. If you have any feedback, questions, or comments about the show, feel free to email me at podcast@iceconsultingllc.com. Thank you once again, and I look forward to having you joining us on our next episode of Heart of the Trial.